Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bowne-Anderson here. I am so excited to be here today with Federico Bianchi to be talking about large language models and moving beyond proofs of concept. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. While we're waiting, perhaps you could introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from, what your interest in large language models and ChatGPT is, whether you're a data scientist or machine learning engineer, what type of work, whether you build recommendation systems or where you work. It'd be great to know a bit about you so we can tailor the conversation accordingly. Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bowne-Anderson here from Outerbounds. Very excited to be here with Federico from Stanford University to be talking about moving beyond proofs of concept with large language models, what they are, what we expect to see in the future, and how we can actually incorporate them into existing software stacks to generate real sustainable business value. We're going to get started in a minute. If between now and then you could introduce yourself in the chat, in the YouTube chat, it'd be great to know what your interest is, why you're here, what type of work you do. This is great. We would have a few people speaking. We have Akhil from India, who's an aspiring data scientist. We have Rama from Paris, who's a senior data engineer in the digital marketing field. We have Edouard Mercier, a software engineer and entrepreneur in Paris, who hasn't been using LLMs so far, but here to discover the state of the art. And so we'll get started in a minute, but I do see nearly 30 people watching already. So a few more people to introduce yourself would be super cool. We have Louis calling in from Southwest Australia, working, and I don't know, a place called Denmark in Southwest Australia. Fascinating. I'll have to look that up. Working as a senior data engineer at Culture Amp. So now we have nearly 40 people. So I'd love it if a few more of you introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know what your interest in LLMs is and what type of work you do. And then we'll get started. So we have Mohammed, a machine learning engineer at Digital Genius. Fantastic. And so great to have you all here. All right, this is great. So welcome everyone. We have data scientists, we have retired academics from computer science in Italy. Federico, where Federico is from and is there at the moment. We have Mohammed, who's a data engineer working on LLMs, AI senior engineers, software developers in Switzerland. We have people from all over the world, which is super exciting. And look, I'm too excited. We're going to have to get started now. So Federico, perhaps you could turn your camera on and we can get up and running.
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone.
Hey man, how are you?
I'm doing great. What about you?
I'm fantastic, and thank you so much for joining me here today. For a bit of context, you live and work in California. You're a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford, but you're currently in Italy.
Yeah, I'm currently back at home, but yes, I live in California, work at Stanford. I'm a postdoc there. I mainly do NLP and do kind of different things within the NLP field. I do a bit of social NLP, a bit of like model development and model analysis. So I've done a lot of things as a researcher, but I'm excited about all this kind of like recent developments in the field about large language models. And I'm happy like you invited me here to talk a bit about this.
It's so great to have you. And we've had, many conversations around this space, but it's great to take one of our conversations public. And also, we were just chatting before, like the space is moving so quickly and growing so quickly. We're excited to have this conversation now, but we're also excited to see how things kind of settle in 6 to 12 months as well. So we're going to do our best to make some predictions, maybe not next word predictions ourselves, but try to think about where the space is going. Yeah. So this is really cool, man. We already have 60 people here, as I was saying, from all walks of life, from all over the world. So really welcome everyone. And please, any questions that come up through the course of this chat, please do ask them, and we'll do our best to get to them. If there are questions we are unable to get to, just due to time constraints, we'll have an asynchronous Ask Me Anything, AMA, on our community Slack afterwards, and I'm pasting the link to that in the YouTube chat. There's a channel called AMA Guests, and we'll just be there for the next week or so. So you ask questions, and then Fede and I can jump in and and answer them, or anything along those lines. Just a bit of bookkeeping. So, I'm head of DevRel, developer relations at Outerbounds, where we build open source software, but also products. And it really, we work on infrastructure and productivity tools for data scientists that allow them to focus on the parts of the stack data scientists love, such as building models and doing actual science, while having easy access to infrastructural layers, such as compute, orchestration, versioning, these types of things. We do this mostly through the open source framework Metaflow that my colleagues built out at Netflix when they ran machine learning infrastructure there, but now is used across a variety of use cases and verticals and companies. So definitely check that out. And if these types of things interest you and these types of frameworks interest you, I'm going to post a link to our GitHub repository. So definitely check it out. And give it a star if it's something that interests you as well. I'll also mention, as I said, we really try to think about all layers of the stack, from data to compute to versioning, orchestration, the deployment story, modeling, feature engineering. And to that end, we have conversations around like the modeling aspects of things and large language models as we're doing now. But we have other events, and our next Fireside chat is on the data aspect of the stack, and really thinking through the unbundled open source data stack. And for example, let's say you have, Parquet files in S3 or something like that. How do you use them for a variety of different things, through machine learning to getting insights to experimentation and all of these types of things? So if that interests you, I've just posted a link to that as well. This is the obligatory, if you like this conversation, please do share with friends and hit subscribe wherever that button should be somewhere. But without further ado, I think we should jump in. So Fede, you introduce yourself. I did want to say a few more words. We mentioned you're a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University, who works across a variety of different NLP-esque things, such as large vision language models, such as FashionCLIP, model understanding, such as limitations of vision language models, and also think a lot about fairness and bias, such as bias in text to image. So I just wanted to give a sense of the different things you work on, and all of these things will come out in our conversation. But you've touched a lot of different things, and that's one of the reasons I was so excited to have you here. And for those just joining, we're here to talk about where the field of large language models is today, and what we think there is with error bars, what we think there is to expect to see in terms of business value once the hype dies down. So we are, if you think about the Gartner hype cycle, we're above the peak of inflated expectations currently, right? So we're going to try to reason about the things we see happening, where we think it may settle, and how really to think about what's happening in the space. So I think we should just jump in, man. And I think maybe a good place to start to set the scene and contextualize what we're talking about is, what even are large language models, and what are they, and what are they capable of?
Yeah, so like there are different kinds of large language models, and like the term large is kind of like weird term, because like there are large and even larger language models. So I guess like the easiest way to explain what a large language model is a tool that does next word prediction as a task. So given a sentence or given a question, what the model is going to do, it is going to add novel words that are predicted on the base on the sentence you started with. So it's kind of like the model is going to output the most likely, most probable sentence given questions, for example. So this is a very simple kind of process, but you can do many things with this kind of next word prediction task. You can think, if you ever tried like one of these ChatGPT, for example, models, the idea behind is that when you ask a question, the model is going to output new words that make sense and are like the most likely to appear in the context of this kind of of the question you asked. And they are capable of many different things, and people have built tons of like cool things. And I think there are tons of like application of this kind of technologies. Question answering is indeed like a very cool application. You can use this kind of tool to ask questions and get answer on many different topics. You can use them as like sparring partners to learn about new things, to chat about interesting topic. You can ask them to ask you questions, so you can use them to prepare for interviews or like to discover new topics, study new topic. But there are also like different kind of application. For example, one large language models that I use a lot is the GitHub Copilot, that is like the tool used to somehow enhance coding, and it kind of does next word prediction in terms of like Python code, at least for me. So it helps you to write code, and it actually like increases my productivity a lot. Like I think like it can increase the productivity of someone that codes like as for a factor of like twice your productivity. Like it's great how helpful this kind of tool are in practice.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And I think it was nice that you talked through why we can get things like ChatGPT, for example, because if you have next word prediction, it isn't initially obvious why you can then have question and answer pairs, right?
Yeah, and like it requires a bit of thinking to understand why this next word prediction thing is also the thing that like is kind of the foundation part of this question and answer pipeline, but even also like of asking a model to write emails about something, or asking like the model to summarize documents. It's still this kind of next word prediction task. There are obviously slight modification to the training pipeline of these models, but the base kind of component is still this kind of like next word kind of prediction thing.
Absolutely. And digging a bit deeper into, I mean, we have people from all walks of life here, and we'll watch it afterwards. Maybe you could say a bit about what's happening in the back end. I mean, we have the neural networks. It's deep learning of a particular form. We hear the term transformer kind of thrown around. So maybe you can just tell us a bit about what's happening there. Maybe at not a super detailed level.
Yeah, of course. So transformer is like an architecture that has been introduced in 2017, originally for machine translation. And it's this kind of like architecture that brought kind of a huge shift in the NLP community, that then like moved to have a shift in the entire AI field. And the general idea is that the transformer is kind of an architecture that like takes in input sentences, and through the use of self-attention, that is this kind of component that helps the model to look at all the different words in a sentence, with through many layers of like depth of this neural network, the model can build a kind of an understanding of how all the words relate to each other. And through this kind of pipeline, the model looks at the different words in the sentence and understand what comes next in a sentence, or in kind of the next word in a sentence. So it's the most abstract layer to think about this is like it's a very efficient computational unit that is very useful to do this kind of task. And like, I think like one of the biggest contribution in the transformer architecture is its efficiency in doing computation. At least this is like, for me, it what like brought the most valuable contribution to the field. Like we have LSTMs before 2017, but we had like limitation of unrolling kind of characteristic of the network because they were not they were sequential and they could not be processed in batch. So transformer like bring this kind of like efficient aspect to the computation of sentences that completely changed the way we do NLP.
Absolutely. And this is really important, I think, because it's one of the reasons that LLMs have been able to capture the cultural consciousness, I think, and become part of the zeitgeist is because ChatGPT will respond to you almost immediately, right? There's like latency is an incredibly important concern here. And we may get to this later, that latency, you can have a lot of input. If you want a lot of output, latency there may be different concerns there. But this efficiency, this rapidness of response is a huge part of the draw here, I think.
I think like latency is still kind of an issue for a lot of like practical application, but
and
definitely,
we'll get to that, yeah.
Definitely like
for the proof of concept though.
Yeah. Definitely like,
yeah.
It's something we were able to scale up very efficiently.
Fantastic. So if you're listening, you will have just caught that for proofs of concept, the latency currently is actually fine. But if we're actually thinking about, further use cases, this is something that we really need to reason through. Great. So we've talked about what LLMs are capable of. I'm interested, and this is maybe a slightly provocative question, what aren't they capable of? And I just want to set the scene a bit, and maybe I'm being slightly hyperbolic here, but, we've been told ChatGPT is going to change the future of work and it's going to displace all of our jobs and all of this. So I would kind of just want to perform a restorative act of bringing the pendulum back slightly there. So maybe you can say a few words about we've talked about what they're capable of, what aren't they capable of?
Yeah, sure. I think like LLMs like ChatGPT, sometimes they cannot be trusted in general for the answer they give. So there is a concern regarding how factual is the information they generate. You can ask, for example, I don't know how well they fix this, but at the first time ChatGPT was out, people asked for like references about, I don't know, topics they were interested in, and ChatGPT started making up references about things. And that's a huge problem because like it gives like a sense of confidence in the answer by saying you can look up this reference to trust what I've just said, but that reference does not exist. So there are issues with definitely like the factuality of what the model says, and that's kind of a big issue for many tasks because if you can't be sure about the answer of the model, you cannot trust it in most of the settings. Other kind of like limitation can be complex reasoning tasks might still be out of the domain. We will need to see a couple of more things when the entire GPT-4 is going to be released. For example, the one that also combined the multimodal part that is not yet out. And also like it's unclear, at least for ChatGPT, there has been some concern about like actual evaluation. So ChatGPT has been published with some evaluation regarding, for example, ability to solve coding problems. But there's been there has been some concern that like the model could have been trained on the test set it was actually used to evaluate it on. So it's sometimes not clear how much we can trust those evaluation. While I've tried ChatGPT and I think it's super useful and like the results are great, there might be some concern on like how well it does on specific tasks. So the biggest question again is like, how do we handle the failure cases? And the other kind of like limits or it's not really an issue with capability, but something that we are probably going to talk about is that there are cases in which you cannot consider the language model safe because people have found ways to like hack into the language model and make it answer or like make it output things that the original developer tried to prevent the model to output. For example, like toxic stuff or like stereotypical aspects that are still kind of a problem, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to recap there, generating factual information is incredibly difficult. Complex reasoning it is tough. How to handle failure cases. Also that we shouldn't consider it safe. I mean, there's huge issues of toxicity. Having said that, I think, well, one of the other issues is the black boxness of it. I mean, ChatGPT, for example, I have no idea what it's trained on, what decisions were made. But whatever they've done, I feel like they've done a highly sophisticated job of making it of combating toxicity in some way. I think. Yeah.
I think sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say they still haven't got a patch for Dan mode. I don't know if anyone's played around with Dan mode on ChatGPT, but there's a mode where you can kind of, make it say things that ChatGPT would never say. And there's Dan definitely is far more toxic than ChatGPT, but
yeah, I think
they've done a very good job, I think.
It's very hard to make the model completely safe. There has been a lot of research in this direction. I think OpenAI hasn't done a lot of work in trying to fix the model. I think they spent 6 months into the entire process of Q&A and red teaming the model before releasing it, because it was probably super easy to generate very problematic stuff that could be even asking the model to, I don't know, how to do harms and how to generating dangerous material. So they actually worked into fixing this, but it's very hard to fix all the issues. And this could open up to many different kind of possible issues when you use this model in practice. So would you feel confident into releasing this kind of model to customers because they can, I don't know, hack it and generate dangerous output just by asking questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested in, we've been saying ChatGPT, but there are so many other LLMs out there. And I mean, one question is in 6 months, will we really still be talking about ChatGPT, or will the conversation, how do we even think about the space? So, I mean, there are a lot of questions flooding my head currently, but think about, we have ChatGPT, we have GPTJ, we have Llama, Lambda, Bloom, Palm, Lava, Dolly, Alpaca, Dolly 2. So this, I mean, I could just keep vomiting names of fascinating LLMs. We have small LLMs, which there's a joke there. They're small, large language models. Isn't that just a language model? I don't know. So how do we even think about this space as a whole? What type of mental models? What should we be focusing? What about BERT, right? Have we forgotten about BERT already? So yeah, tell us a bit. I mean, there's barely a question there. The real question is how to think about this incredibly quickly growing and busy space.
Yeah. So first thing to say is that most of these things came out in the last 3 months. At least the cool things came out in the last 3 months, and it's crazy. It's very
absolutely
hard.
That's one of the most wild parts of it, right? I need to sleep.
Yeah. And I'm also not able to keep up with all this thing. And I'm maybe reminded by other people when stuff comes out.
Totally.
It's very difficult to keep track of everything. And that is why I think we need to wait a couple of months probably to understand what is gonna stick. And there are different ways to think about the entire field. One is in terms of open and closed model. And ChatGPT, for example, is a closed model, and you cannot access it. You need to call it by using OpenAI's API, and that might be something you don't want to do. But the model is high quality, so that's definitely an advantage of the model. We have right now open source alternatives. So since ChatGPT, that was around December 2022, there has been kind of a wave, very strong wave to generate competitors of ChatGPT that are indeed open source. But also these open source has kind of a limitation with respect to probably licensing that we can probably discuss in a bit. But there has been like a lot of work in generating alternatives language models. For example, one is Llama, that is the language model that was trained by Meta a couple of, I think, months ago. I don't remember when it came out, but people had started building ChatGPT models like on Llama, and right now we have like, I think Hugging Face Chat is based on that. We have GPT-J that is a bit older, I think. It's a couple of years older, I guess, that has been built by Eleuter AI, and again, it's open source. And the good thing about this model is that it has like a commercial license, I guess. So it can be used by people. Dolly, that is a very recent model, has been trained using GPT-J and has been fine-tuned on instructions. And what does it mean? It means that when you train a large language model on just the next word prediction task, you end up with something that is generally not as useful as it could be. What you want is a model that kind of like behaves well when you give it instruction. So a model like Dolly or a fine-tuned instruction model is fine-tuned using instructions that are like questions and answer. Or for example, training a sample for this model are summarize this text, given the text, and the output is the summary. Given some example of this kind of task, the model learns to do task in a much better way. So when you actually deploy it, it works very well to do this kind of tasks.
Great. So this is in this space of everything that's happening at the moment. I presume people know how to go to OpenAI and start interacting with ChatGPT, right? But I'm wondering for people, you know, programmers and scientists and data scientists and ML people who maybe haven't had a lot of experience with it, how can they get started with playing around with large language models today?
Yeah, of course. There are kind of different levels of abstraction. It depends, I guess, how much code you're willing to write and how much time you have to put into understanding what's going on, going on behind the scene, I guess. Because there are also like different methods to interact with a language model. There are different kind of pipelines to train a language model if you have data. So I think like the main resource, if you want to understand a bit what's going on without like going too deep into the kind of entire difficulties that like I feel like machine learning can open, is still Hugging Face. Hugging Face is like this kind of course in which you can go through the fine-tuning of a supervised language model for example, classification tasks. That's gonna give you like a very good intro on how to actually add your own, maybe small large language models on your own laptop doing things, and that could be already good enough to do many different tasks. It's very controllable. You can do whatever you want with it, and it usually run on consumer hardware most of the time. It might be slow, but at least it's enough to start playing with it. We're right now starting like to.
I'm just adding a link to, I mean, I presume a lot of people know about Hugging Face, but I've just included a link in the chat for those interested. And once again, if any questions come up, do feel free to ask them in the YouTube chat as well. Sorry, please go on, Fede.
Yeah, sure. And like there are right now with all this like huge development, there are kind of a lot of packages that wrap APIs for you that are coming out. For example, there is LangChain that is kind of an abstraction that you can use to kind of seamlessly, let me use the word talk with multiple language models without kind of like having to delve into different kind of setups, different kind of systems, building kind of like first layers of, I don't know, safety. So LangChain is another thing that I think it's like very interesting to look at, because it's not like a scientific revolution, but it's very useful. It's like empirically, and like it's a good engineering effort to make language models accessible to the broader audience. And finally, if you kind of want to maybe write some code that is mostly API, I think that like using Cohere's or like OpenAI APIs is still an effective way to deal with language models. You can prompt for questions, ask for classification. There is an entire field that is called prompt engineering, that is kind of the art of asking questions to language models that is becoming more and more relevant. There are courses coming up that have been like advertised everywhere on most social media platform, and this is the direction of like talking directly with the model using, for example, APIs.
Great. And people can check out the OpenAI APIs. And I've just shared a link to Cohere and LangChain as well. Yuri Gordon has a great question. We're going to get to this type of thing later, actually, Yuri, but I do want to foreshadow this. Yuri's asking about security measures and tools to handle different risks. Oh, pardon me. I got a bit of hay fever. I'm getting so excited. And yeah, Akil has an interesting question around integrating ChatGPT into IDEs and that being useful for programmers. He also says, is this a cause of fear in programmers that AI will take over? I'll maybe say a few words about that, because I do think talking about code assistants, you've mentioned Copilot, but in all honesty, man, like if I can get stuff like ChatGPT to generate templates and basic, control flow stuff and, skeletons, like I want to make sure, and all the business logic makes sense and all the domain expertise that I need to inject into my software works. But I'm all for, having a coding assistant helping me with the stuff, especially the code I don't enjoy writing, but anything business critical, of course. Like, I'll take a non-controversial analogy. If I'm building a bridge, I'm a structural engineer and I'm building a bridge and I need to figure out how thick to make a pylon to support a part of the bridge. And I need to make sure that it supports this part of the bridge. I'm not going to outsource the measurements of that to something like ChatGPT or a large language model. Maybe I'll get it to do the basic design and these types of things, but anything that would result in the bridge collapsing, I'm going to make sure that I figure out by hand, right? So anything that's super mission critical like that. So maybe you can speak about that in the software world briefly, Fede.
Yeah, I think like I wouldn't kind of give anything that is mission critical to ChatGPT to develop, or at least if I do, I would then like check it manually before ever deploying it. When I say that, like I think Copilot is useful is in a context of helping you writing code that takes long to write, but is not like highly complex or kind of like very sophisticated domain kind of code. I don't think Copilot can yet like do domain modeling for you. You still have to come up with like your own object-oriented infrastructure, and like you need to organize classes in a meaningful way that respect your kind of flow. What is very useful as when I develop is this kind of like very boring task that takes a lot of boilerplate code that everybody has written and it's already on GitHub, and that's how Copilot, and that's why Copilot is able like to efficiently write that directly for you. Yeah, definitely. Like I don't expect like software development to disappear soon as a thing. I expect us being much, or at least software developer to be much more productive with this kind of tools. And I expect people to work more on verifying the code that this kind of tool come up with.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, we're going to talk more about these types of things later as well, particularly with respect to risk. We actually have a lot of interesting questions coming up in the chat that I'll try to interleave. If there are any questions we unfortunately do not get to, please do come and ask them in our asynchronous AMA that we're going to have over the next week on our community Slack. And I'm just going to put that link in there again, but I'm going to do my best to to get to as many questions as possible. So we've identified that the LLMs we're seeing at the moment are great for proofs of concept and playing around and doing a lot of fun stuff. But as you know, something we think a lot about at Metaflow and Outerbounds is how do you actually productionize machine learning models, and how do you incorporate the wisdom of machine learning into existing software stacks? So I'm interested in how can people actually productionize LLMs and incorporate them into their already pre-existing software stacks in their jobs currently, or thoughts about the future?
Yeah, I think like currently the best way to think about this is to use LLMs as not kind of maybe core components of the pipeline. It seems like the field is evolving so fast, and like we cannot always trust this kind of pipelines. And even as a researcher, we are struggling into understanding this kind of things in terms of like how they work. What I think it's really useful is to maybe use them as kind of like analytics tools for maybe your data, or even classification tools in which you can use them. Like, I don't know, if you have a conversational agent, you could use one of these large language models to do intent classification, and you can do predictive analytics. You can do many things. The thing I think, like, you can replace many steps of a pipeline with a language model. You can use them to do control flow. You can use them to do many things. One thing I think like we are probably going to talk about next, that I think it's very, very important, that I want to mention it now, is that we should treat LLMs as we treat software, in a sense that we have Q&A to test software, or like to stress test, and we should do the same with language models. So there should be someone in the team that kind of like tries to break the part of the pipeline we build with LLMs, because we know that there might be issue. And while software is kind of often rule-based, and so we can come up with reasonable flows of things that can happen, this is not true with language models that are by nature stochastic, so they can come up with kind of different replies. And this kind of models evolve over time, so the original ChatGPT is not the ChatGPT we have today. If you use the original ChatGPT API and you update it, you might not have the same result. So that could be like a breaking update in your in your kind of stack. So I would
I mean, you lose reproducibility, which is a basic tenet of science, right?
Yeah, you might have kind of still. I think like OpenAI give you the possibility to keep asking old model, but you're playing with an old technology. They might have fixed a couple of things. One issue is that, for example, ChatGPT knowledge in ChatGPT was, I think, like the last kind of training data was from the end of 2021. So ChatGPT is not, let me use again an anthropomorphizing word, but like is not aware of recent things. So when they are gonna update it, you might want to update your language model too, or like your API too, because like you want the model to be aware of recent events. But that could be like a breaking operation. So that is why I think like we should always be. It's necessary to have a team that kind of like stress test every LLM integration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've also shared 2 links. You're aware of these posts, Federico, but I'll just share them very quickly. That we've thought about this a lot, and this is in some ways shameless self-promotion, but it is highly relevant, thinking through the future of the infrastructure stack for large language models. I'm not going to go through it in detail now, but really once we have things that are possible, such as large language models, how do we make them easy for everyone to use with infrastructure? And the way we think about it is that data scientists care a lot about what's happening at the top and not what's happening at the bottom, but they want access to the infrastructure. Both these things are exacerbated with large language models. We really care about the modeling, but we do have a significant amount of infrastructure needed still. And then what we see happening in the space, and there are lots of different types of things we're seeing. We see open source foundation models that maybe we then want to fine tune for different business concerns with LLM embeddings. And then we, on the other side, we see perhaps we want to just, buy APIs and use them and pay per token or whatever it is from vendors. So there are a lot of different use cases here. And I shared another post, which is, this is relatively a high level post, how we think about productionizing things using Metaflow. And we did this using Databricks. We productionized it and trained it using it was Databricks open source foundation model Dolly. So that's just a bit of context on how we're thinking about things there, and a bit of quote unquote shameless self-promotion. But I posted those things in the chat for those interested. Great. So once again, there are a lot of great questions, and I hope to get to some of them. But I am interested in thinking through at least initial thoughts on how LLMs can go beyond proof of concept and be used to create sustainable business value and defensible business moats. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we need to wait a bit to see what the field's gonna come up in the next couple of months. What I see is a lot of cool applications, obviously, but that we don't know how well they gonna generalize. I still think that some of these things are already useful and can already have business value, like large language model for classification. For example, the example I made before of intent classification with large language models is already a very good kind of possible business value that can improve a lot of aspects in your conversational pipeline, for example. That's definitely something. When I say that I'm not sure what's gonna come up next is more on the front end chat with a conversational AI model by itself that is backed by ChatGPT. That is something I still have kind of some restraint on saying that it's gonna be the next application, because of we are probably gonna talk next, but because of the fact that there is no regulation, there are of a lot of issue with respect to safety. So what I think the business value that I see kind of here is for all those tasks that do not require the model to be in contact with the user, I guess. And classification tasks are all kind of things that for most tasks, we can reach good accuracy rate with this kind of models right now. So I truly believe that there is something there that can be very useful for most businesses. And also we are kind of building kind of low scale model that everybody can somehow now use and implement. So what the problem a couple of months ago was that the only thing that was out there was OpenAI, and it was big. You had to pay for it. You could not instantiate it on your own platform. What we are seeing in the last couple of weeks, month, whatever, is that a lot of models that can run on kind of consumer hardware can be used and loaded into your own platform. There is obviously an analysis on the cost of having this kind of platform running, but still I think we are moving also in a possible direction in which you can build your own small LLM based business analytics kind of mini platform that you can use to generate value.
Yeah, awesome. So we've got a few somewhat related questions in the chat that I thought we could get to before moving on to a lot of the risks. They're kind of related, but Rex has an interesting question that Rex feels we place too much emphasis on producing a nice LLM output that's unbiased and friendly because we want them to seem human. And Rex asked, wouldn't it be sufficient to acknowledge they are AI, artificial intelligence, and move on? Jared has a related question that the product people in his space are still thinking LLMs can generate creative text. Any thoughts on communicating the human AI interface and agent capabilities to non-technical team members? And Alm has a question around explainability. So I wonder if we can just think through these things of whether we just want to, acknowledge it's AI or create human interfaces that seem human to people, and how we think about explainability in this context as well.
Yeah, so I think like having a chatbot that like replies like a human makes it also more successful in terms of like communication itself. So when you communicate with chatbot right now online, old rule-based kind of chatbot, you feel that is a chatbot, and the first thing I usually ask when I'm with customer service is, can I talk with a human? So I think like having a more friendly AI assistant is something that is useful. I understand that like there is a limitation obviously to that, and how much that thing can actually do that. In terms of like explainability, the question is we can ask the model to explain is kind of answers, and this is related to like some of the recent developments in kind of the way to prompt models. There is this kind of thing called chain of thought, for example. There is a technique of prompting that asks the model to explain its reasoning, and people have been able to show that when you ask the model to explain its reasoning in answering a question, the model performs better. So there is definitely something in explainability related to this, but if we are talking in terms of explainability with respect to the more standard explainability or interpretability definition, still these models are not explainable at all. So these are huge models with tons of parameters. We don't know why they answer something the way they answer. So there is kind of these two levels of the explainability, I guess, factor. We don't know how these models work, so we cannot really define explainable behavior, but we can still ask the model to explain the reasoning, and we can look at the reasoning and see if it is at least self-consistent.
Yeah, great. So now I'd really like to get in. We've had several questions around this already. We've kind of danced around it, talked around it. What type of risks do we need to consider with respect to large language models, and how do they trade off with utility, usefulness of LLMs?
Yeah, so one risk is that like it is possible to hack LLMs and make them do whatever you want. So we currently do not have super strong technique to make the model behave as we want 100% of the times, and that's something that we have to acknowledge. Given this, it will be not wise maybe to somehow connect directly a user with a language model that has access to a file system, because if the user asks the model, it has access to the file system itself. So that's definitely something it's like giving pseudo access to the user itself. So this is something we need to take in consideration when we build pipelines in which language models are actually put in. And this is more like, I guess, a practical business risk, because like maybe the LLMs has access to like company data. I hack the LLM and I get company data. So there are this kind of risks. There are also other kind of risks that are more ethical and societal kind of risks. We know that model can output toxic text. We know that model can output like stereotypical text. One of the first example that I think I saw when ChatGPT came out, and like I said, ChatGPT was red teamed, and there was Q8.6 bumps over ChatGPT to fix errors. And when it came out, one of the first example of bias was asking ChatGPT to write a script in JavaScript to select the best kind of developer based on race and gender. And what ChatGPT wrote was like a script that selected if gender equal male and race equal white, return best developer. So there are issues there are societal and ethical concerns regarding how we use language models. There are privacy risks. You could ask language models to output private information of people, because if you consider that like this model has probably been trained on everything that has been posted online, and when I mean everything, I mean everything, it probably has some kind of like privacy data that you can prompt it for. So this
Yeah.
opens up to many privacy issues. We then have like toxic text generation. There was a famous example with GPT-3. There is a famous paper that shows that, for example, when you prompt, I think they fixed this problem, but like originally when you prompted the original GPT-3 model with the sentence, two Muslims enter a church, the completion that GPT-3 was doing was something like very stereotypical and very kind of racist, associating terrorism to the two Muslim people. So it is kind of a problematic setting that even when you think about using this kind of models to generate stories might be kind of generate issues if we embed stereotypes and bad behaviors in this kind of possible sentences. And another risk is obviously like more related to privacy and copyright, and this is kind of a gray area that is not even super clear to me what's the correct way to do. But for example, one issue that I think the European Union was discussing is that let me do this again. Two users can get the same output from ChatGPT. Who's the copyright owner of the output? If they both use that. So that's an open question, like who owns the copyright of that thing right now? The model, the two users. So it's kind of a gray area, and it's not clear how these things are gonna be resolved in the next months. I guess like for most private usages, this kind of models are okay to use, but the privacy and the copyright kind of thing opens up to many issues. And like, what if the model outputs a famous quote that is copyrighted and you don't know
exactly
it? What if you don't know it and you use that?
I'm going to post a link to, I mean, this is a question about generative AI that doesn't only apply to large language models. Stable diffusion. We created some things which generated images of celebrities and submitted that to a publication, and they were like, we're not sure about the copyright of this, whether we can actually publish. It was a photo of Nicolas Cage as the Joker or something like that, right? And they weren't certain quite, how copyright around these types of images would work. Also, the lack of transparency around the training data as well, I think, plays into the copyright question. But I think we've actually seen that, I'm going to post this article from The Verge, and it's a class action lawsuit that is being launched against Microsoft, GitHub, and OpenAI around Copilot in particular. And so code that it generates. There are other concerns and societal concerns, particularly the communities that we're part of. What happens to communities such as Stack Overflow when we all start interacting with large language models instead of contributing to community-based forums and that type of stuff, right? The other thing that comes to mind with these concerns is they take on a different flavor or tint or hue when thinking about large language models and generative AI, but they aren't necessarily new concerns. If we think about potential racial biases in large language models, this is something which Google has had to think about a lot, right? When you used to Google, I think an example, when you used to Google beautiful, do an image search, the first 100 results were white women, right? Now, of course, that isn't representative of what beauty is considered worldwide. When you Google CEO, it was white men, right? So these types of things. Also, the propensity for misinformation and things to be factually incorrect. I mean, Google snippets will tell me all types of crazy stuff that just isn't true all the time. And I mean, there've been cases of people using Google Maps and driving off a pier into the ocean because the map tells them to go into the ocean. So actually thinking about, that's kind of like using ChatGPT to build a bridge that falls down, right? Like it's not only common sense, but we need our specific forms of domain expertise a question of cybernetics, how we relate to machines, how we build things with machines, what we take responsibility for as builders and humans navigating the world, right?
Yeah, truly, that's super true. And I think like why this is harder with language models is that we don't really know how they do the stuff they do. And like the example you made about like the beautiful example on Google, what Google could do is that they could fix that by, I don't know, changing the results. This might be harder to do with a language model because with different prompts, you get different kind of answers. So there is a kind of an effect of stochasticity that makes it very hard to control all the outputs. And like if you think about then mode, you can like try to build all the guardrails you want, but if you find a way to enter the kind of then mode to act the model, then you're back at like step one. So it's very hard to think about how to build safe language models that they can talk to people. I wouldn't feel safe to give ChatGPT to a child, I guess.
Along these lines, we have an interesting question from Rex. If we were to produce a more pure input data set, say free from racial connotation, could we avoid such issues with racial bias? I'm sure you have your thoughts about this, but I would actually say it's perhaps philosophically possible to do that. I've never seen it practically possible. And I'll give one example. You can, let's say you remove race from a data set, but you leave in, and this is a classic example, you leave in zip code or postcode in Australia or zip code in the US. Funnily, and quite intuitively now, we know that zip code is highly correlated with race. So even though if we try to remove all types of things, what we'll see is that it still actually includes racial biases. Similarly, we can see all types of gender biases, even if you remove gender. So there was the example of a recruiting tool that Amazon built, where they removed gender from this recruiting tool, but they did some natural language processing on resumes, which extracted colleges. And so people who went to all female colleges were ranked as less certainty for their viability for any given position. And so this automated recruiting tool pretty much rejected slews of women without gender or biological sex being included in the training data. There are a couple of examples that spring to mind, but maybe you're closer to the language model side of this, Fede.
Yeah, sure. I think like it's very hard to fix the data, and like people have tried, but I think it's not easy to come up with like a clean data set. And consider that like Llama, for example, have been trained on 1 trillion tokens, and even thinking
1
about
trillion.
I think so. Yeah, 1 trillion tokens. So coming up with a clean version of that doesn't seem to be possible. But also, even coming up with a clean version seems to like kind of remove representation of things. There are things you want to keep in terms of like representation of, for example, probably ethnical and cultural values. You don't want to kind of like remove cultural aspects of the word. You don't want to remove the representation that people have and a close connection they have to culture. So it's very hard to come up with like a good way to fix this kind of problems and biases. I think like there was an example explained by the folks at OpenAI when they trained their text-to-image model DALL-E, that they say that they tried to come up with a filtered version of their data, but that actually made the problem worse initially, because when you try to like remove some of the content, you also completely change the distribution. So let's say you remove all the mention to ethnicity, you are gonna like, it's not that you are gonna affect only ethnicity, you are gonna affect all the things that are connected to ethnicity in your data. So you're gonna completely shift the distribution of the data, and you're gonna get completely different results that are also biased. So bias is a complex topic, and the bias is very complex, and it's not just like something that I think you can quickly solve with simple data cleaning.
We'll need to wrap up in a bit, but we've kind of talked around regulation as well. And I just wanted to point out that you live and work in the United States. You're currently in Italy. There seems to be minimal regulation, if any, in the US. However, in Italy, correct me if I'm wrong, but ChatGPT has been banned.
ChatGPT is back since a couple of days ago in Italy. Yes. So
right.
I think like ChatGPT agreed to like have when you open ChatGPT in Italy now, there is like a modal window that says I agree, I am, I don't know, above 18 years old, whatever, and you have to click I agree. So ChatGPT, I don't know if it's fully GDPR compliant, but it's somehow coming closer, I guess, to this kind of thing. So what Italy complained about was probably like this kind of like security issue, and we can kind of like separate, I guess, the concern and the measure taken. So the concern was like there was an issue with probably privacy and security on ChatGPT, and I think the concern was well motivated because we know that there was kind of a somehow a breach, or somehow there was a problem with ChatGPT for which I don't know if you saw this, but for example, some users were able to see the history of other user and like some kind of financial information. For example, the last digits of the credit card were leaked somewhere, if I remember well. So there was concern, and the concern was well motivated. We can then discuss if like the measure taken by the Italian Garante della Privacy, that is the institute that like kind of controls, so like oversees the privacy issues, if the measure was a good measure to take, but the concern was kind of real, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we'll see evolve a lot more in the coming weeks, months, and years.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like even
with something
with,
this
like,
transformational.
Even with this open source language model, the problem is gonna be the same. You've been training a model on 1 trillion tokens. Sure, some privacy information is gonna be there, and even your tweets that you deleted a couple of years ago, maybe they are there, and someone can extract them from the data.
Fascinating. It's interesting that violates Twitter's terms of service, right? But it depends, when we're scraping the internet, who knows? All bets are off, right?
Yeah. And like there is this difference between like doing a thing that for academic use, for example, Llama as a license that is, I think, purely academic, you cannot use for commercial usages. And so that you kind of use this purely for research to understand how language model work and what you can do with them. And it's another kind of thing, do this commercially with like commercially available models that then are deployed in real products.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we're going to have to wrap up, but this has been a whirlwind tour through all of these different aspects of large language models, and some things hopefully we can expect to see in the future. I'd like to thank, we've had so many great questions. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. We weren't able to get to all of them. So once again, if you want to join us for our Async AMA, please do join us in our community Slack. I've put the link there one more time, and we'll be in the channel AMA guests, but I'll announce that in the announcements channel. So thank you all so much for joining us. Also, and most of all, thank you, Federico, for bringing your expertise and just good, engaged chatting vibes that I always enjoy having with you. So I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great. Like I love chatting about this kind of thing. So I'm happy to answer any question that like people have on the chat.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you once again, everyone, and we'll see you on Slack. It was so great to and Aardvark Pepper, great name, just asked. It's the AMA guests. So look forward to seeing you there. And thank you, Dean. A lot of people are saying thank you. So really great to have you all here, and see you on Slack. All right. Ciao.